I have spent most of my life around money, and one of the strangest things I ever discovered is that most people are not poor because they are lazy. They are poor because they were taught the wrong map. That is a harder thing to see. Laziness is visible. A wrong map is not. A wrong map can be passed from parents to children with perfect sincerity. It can be repeated by teachers, bankers, brokers, television hosts, planners, politicians, and well-meaning relatives for 50 years without anyone realizing that the map itself is leading people in circles. That is what I want to talk about. Not because I enjoy sounding dramatic, I do not. And not because I think there is some smoky room full of billionaires laughing while the country suffers. That sort of story is too easy. And reality is usually more dangerous than that, because reality does not need villains to produce bad outcomes. It only needs a system of incentives and a population that does not understand what the incentives are doing to them. That is enough. People say conspiracy and immediately imagine a secret meeting. I do not think that way. I think in terms of structures, and one of the most powerful structures in modern financial life was built on a change most people still do not understand, even though it quietly shaped almost every paycheck, mortgage, savings account, pension, retirement plan, and household financial decision that followed. The year was 1971. That date matters more than most Americans realize. Before then, the dollar was tied, however imperfectly, to gold. There was still a visible connection between the paper in your wallet and something outside politics. It was not a perfect world. No monetary system built by human beings ever is, but there was at least a constraint, a hard anchor that limited how freely the currency could float away from discipline. Then President Nixon closed the gold window. In plain language, the United States moved fully into a fiat currency era. Now, I want to slow down here because a great many people hear phrases like fiat currency and immediately think this is either a history lecture or an ideological argument. It is neither. It is a practical fact with practical consequences. Fiat money is money because the government says it is money. It is not redeemable for a fixed quantity of some hard asset. It is not anchored in the old way. It lives on confidence, taxation power, military power, productive power, legal tender laws, and the broad social belief that tomorrow other people will still accept it. That sounds abstract until you understand what follows from it. Once money is no longer tied to something outside the system, the temptation to create more of it becomes much stronger. Credit can expand more aggressively. Debt can grow more aggressively. Asset prices can inflate more easily. Governments can borrow more. Consumers can borrow more. Banks can multiply claims more freely. Everyone feels richer for a while because numbers rise. The problem is that the numbers are not the same thing as wealth. That is the first lie the system tells. It tells people that more currency is the same thing as more wealth. Sometimes it is, often it is not. If the purchasing power behind the currency is being thinned, then higher nominal balances can coexist with lower real strength. A person may have more dollars and less security. A country may have larger markets and more fragile citizens. A generation may feel richer while becoming more dependent, more leveraged, and more exposed. That is what I mean by a wrong map. The map says more dollars equal more wealth. Reality says it depends what those dollars can still buy, what assets stand behind them, what debts stand against them, and whether the holder understands the difference between a number on paper and a real claim on productive value. After 1971, something else accelerated. Credit became a cultural operating system. Credit card spread, home equity borrowing became normal. Debt stopped feeling like a special event and started feeling like an ordinary extension of identity. Houses became ATMs, cars became subscriptions, consumption became smoother, faster, easier, and less painful because the pain was pushed into the future. That matters. Human beings are not wired well for delayed pain. If you let a person have the pleasure now and send the cost later, he will almost always behave as though the cost matters less than it does. That is not because he is evil or stupid. It is because his nervous system is ancient and the financing structure is modern. This is one of the great profitable mismatches of our age. The banks, card companies, brokers, and asset managers do not need you to be malicious. They only need you to be ordinary. They only need you to want comfort now, status now, relief now, approval now, and to accept monthly payment language instead of total cost language. Once you do that, the system can make a great deal of money from your confusion. I want to make something very clear. I do not believe wealth itself is evil. I have benefited from capitalism tremendously. I believe productive capitalism is one of the most powerful wealth-creating systems ever developed. But productive capitalism is not the same thing as mass financial confusion. They coexist. And if you do not know the difference, you become raw material for one while admiring the slogans of the other. That is why 2008 matters. Not only because it was a crash. Crashes are part of history. 2008 matters because it showed the public, for a brief moment, how the machine really behaves when the people at the center have every incentive to keep complexity high, opacity intact, and accountability soft. A great many people still tell themselves the crisis was mainly a housing event that is too shallow. Housing was the stage. Ignorance was the fuel in the years leading up to the crisis. Mortgages were made to people who could not truly support them. Those mortgages were packaged, sliced, rated, and sold through structures many ordinary investors could not understand, and many professionals only pretended to understand. Weak credits were mixed into stronger pools and then given ratings that suggested safety. Pension funds bought them, institutions bought them. People trusted the labels because they were trained to trust the labels. That is one of the most profitable features of modern finance. It uses language as camouflage. A AAA label can hide ugly risk if the buyer is not looking through the wrapper to the borrower. A retirement plan can hide poor economics if the owner never asks what the plan is actually doing to his future. A house can be called an asset while draining a family every month. A savings account can be called prudent while silently losing purchasing power year after year. The wrapper is one of the system's favorite tricks. The wrapper makes people feel informed enough not to ask the second question. What is this really? By 2008, the answer began to show itself. Those beautiful structures were full of rot. The defaults rose. The marks failed, the banks wobbled, the financial system stood near the edge. Then the public learned another truth. When institutions are systemically important enough, the state often socializes losses after private actors privatize the gains. That is exactly what bailouts are. The people who help create the structure profit from the structure. And defend the structure often survive with taxpayer support while ordinary people absorb the job losses, foreclosures, retirement damage, and long recovery. That fact made many people furious. It should have. But anger without education changes very little. The more important question was not whether people should be angry. The more important question was whether they would learn what the episode revealed about money. Most did not. That is why the same deeper pattern still works. The public gets outraged at the event and remains financially illiterate about the mechanism. So let us talk about the mechanism. If you want to understand why some people get richer while working inside the same currency system that makes other people feel increasingly cornered, you need to understand a distinction so simple that many educated adults spend their whole lives avoiding it. Assets versus liabilities. Now, I know some people roll their eyes when this subject comes up because it has been abused by motivational nonsense. Fine, the abuse does not make the distinction untrue. An asset puts money in your pocket. A liability takes money out. That is the cleanest practical definition. It is not perfect for every accounting context, but for households it is extraordinarily useful because it slices through an enormous amount of self-deception. The average person thinks his house is an asset because it is the biggest thing he owns and because society repeatedly flatters him for owning it. But if the house requires a mortgage payment, property taxes, insurance, repairs, maintenance, utilities, furnishings, and constant care, then in lived economic terms it behaves like a liability while you are living in it. It may appreciate. It may become part of net worth on paper. But monthly, practically, behaviorally, it is pulling cash from the household that matters. Not because owning a home is always a bad decision. I do not believe that. It matters because people call every emotionally satisfying purchase an asset and then wonder why their cash flow stays weak. A true asset improves your future earning power or sends money to you. A rental property that produces real cash after all expenses may be an asset. A business you own that distributes profit may be an asset. A stock portfolio of strong productive companies may be an asset. A bond paying interest may be an asset. Your primary residence can become part of wealth over time. But if your whole household structure depends on you constantly feeding it, then in practical terms it is not serving the same economic role as a real cash producing asset. This is not an attack on homeownership. It is an attack on self-congratulation masquerading as analysis. I have seen households earning good money declare themselves prosperous because the house looked prosperous from the street while their actual financial life remained thin, anxious, and dependent on the next paycheck. That is a dangerous illusion. And illusions are what the modern financial system sells most efficiently. The same thing happens with cars. People finance a depreciating machine, add insurance, maintenance, fuel, taxes, and financing costs, then call it part of their success. It may well be part of their comfort. It is not the sort of asset that makes future cash flow easier unless the car directly supports productive earning in a way that exceeds its cost. The same thing happens with education when it becomes debt without earning power. The same thing happens with lifestyle subscriptions, club memberships, luxury consumption, and every other expense the culture tells people they deserve because they work hard. Hard work does not transform a liability into an asset. Only cash flow does that. This is where people start getting uncomfortable because the truth begins rearranging their self-image. That is healthy discomfort. If a person does not understand assets and liabilities, then he is not really making financial decisions. He is participating in social theater with financing attached, and that is exactly where the system wants him: working, earning, paying taxes, buying liabilities, feeding intermediaries, then repeating the cycle while calling it adulthood. This is why the retirement discussion matters so much too. When the 401k era replaced the older defined benefit pension world, the burden shifted quietly from institution to individual. That was one of the most important structural financial changes of the last half-century. Under a traditional pension, the company bore the responsibility of funding a lifetime promise. Under the 401k model, the worker bears the investment risk, the allocation risk, the behavioral risk, the longevity risk, and often much of the fee drag without fully understanding any of it. Again, I do not say that defined contribution plans are useless. They can be excellent tools when used intelligently. But the language around them has hidden something important. Responsibility was outsourced downward. The ordinary employee was told he had been empowered. In some ways he had. In another and more important sense, he had been handed a complicated machine and told that discipline, market behavior, tax rules, withdrawals, sequence risk, inflation, fees, and longevity were now his problem. This is a great arrangement if you are a system reducing long-term liabilities. It is a less pleasant arrangement if you are an ordinary worker who is never taught how money actually works. Then the same people who were handed the risk were told to save. Just save, be prudent, put money aside, trust the experts, trust the bank, trust the planner, trust the product. This is where I part company with almost the whole culture. Saving alone is not a strategy. Saving in a currency system that loses purchasing power year after year, inside accounts that may pay pitiful rates while inflation compounds against you, is not a strategy for becoming strong. It may be a useful stage. It is not the destination. Cash is useful for liquidity. Cash is useful for reserves. Cash is useful for optionality. But cash as a long-term religion is often just slow surrender. The bank loves your confusion here. You deposit your money. The bank pays you almost nothing. The bank uses your money as low-cost fuel. You feel responsible because the balance is there. Meanwhile, the real value of the cash erodes and the institution earns on the spread. That is not prudence. That is passivity with a receipt. I am not telling people to live without cash reserves. Quite the opposite. I like reserves. I like liquidity. I like not being forced into stupid decisions because of timing pressure, but I want people to understand the role of cash. Cash is a tool, not a final answer. If you use it as a final answer, then inflation becomes your silent business partner and it takes an ugly share of the economics. This is why the rich behave differently. Not all rich people. Certainly many rich people are confused too, but the people who truly understand money do not mostly worship cash. They deploy cash. They use it to acquire assets. They use debt intelligently when the structure favors them. They use tax rules intentionally. They buy things that produce and compound rather than simply things that display well. That is the real divide. Not rich versus poor in the emotional sense, investor mindset versus employee mindset. This distinction is often misunderstood because people think employee means having a job. A person can have a job and still think like an investor. A person can own a business and still think like an employee. The difference is in the operating system. The employee mindset says, I trade my time for money, I pay my obligations, I save what is left, and I hope the system treats me fairly enough to survive. The investor mindset says, I direct cash toward assets, I understand what puts money in and what takes money out. I use the system rather than merely living inside it. And I build streams that can eventually work whether I am awake or asleep. That is not greed. That is the only path to becoming hard to corner. I care deeply about becoming hard to corner. If your life depends on every paycheck, every boss, every quarter, every policy shift, and every good month of your own physical energy, then your financial structure is weak even if your income looks good. A strong financial structure owns productive assets. It owns claims on businesses. It may own rental property, royalties, intellectual property, operating businesses, or other streams that are not fully dependent on one body trading 1 unit of time for 1 unit of pay. That is what financial freedom really means. Not a giant number to brag about, not a yacht, not applause. Freedom means less dependence on the next hour of your own labor as the only source of economic life. Most people say they want freedom and then build the opposite. They increase liabilities faster than assets. They finance lifestyle instead of systems. They keep the house, the cars, the subscriptions, the dining, the appearances, the neighborhood, and the obligations rising together until their income, no matter how large, is permanently spoken for. Then they call themselves successful. That is not success. That is captivity with leather seats. I think a lot about my father here. My father was a good man, a very good man. He had integrity, intelligence, and public spirit. But he also believed deeply in the traditional path: education, career, salary, responsibility, public service. He worked hard and was respected. My so-called rich dad saw the world differently. He cared about cash flow. He cared about ownership. He cared about what assets could be made to do over time. That contrast shaped me. One man believed in working hard inside the system and being rewarded fairly. The other believed in understanding the rules of the system better than the average participant and structuring his life so the rules worked on his behalf. Those are not the same belief. The system prefers the first kind of person because the first kind of person is easier to predict and monetize. That is why financial education matters so much. Once you understand the difference between currency and money, between assets and liabilities, between saving and investing, between wage dependence and cash flow dependence, between outer symbols and inner strength, the world starts looking very different. You cannot unsee it. Your house no longer feels like pure virtue just because people clap when you buy it. Your savings account no longer feels like a winning plan just because the bank's branding uses words like secure and responsible. The 401k no longer feels like a magical retirement answer just because an HR department handed you a brochure and a match. The expensive car no longer feels like a reward if you can see the future cash flow it is eating. The financial planner no longer feels automatically wise just because the suit is good and the vocabulary is soft. You begin asking harder questions. What does this put in my pocket? What does this remove? Who gets the spread? Who bears the risk? What am I actually building? That is the beginning of adulthood with money. And it is remarkable how many people never arrive there because the culture keeps rewarding them just enough for not asking. A person can live his whole life in a respectable financial trance. Good income. Weak assets, large liabilities, some retirement account, some savings, some stress, some envy, some confusion about why every raise disappears. That is ordinary. I do not want ordinary. If ordinary means dependence, I want strength. And strength begins with clarity, not complexity. Clarity. So what would I tell an ordinary person to do once he sees this? First, stop lying to yourself about what you own. Call liabilities, liabilities. Call assets, assets. Make the household statement honest before you make it elegant. Second, build real assets before you build a fancier identity. Own productive businesses directly or through low-cost funds. Own things that can pay you. Own systems, not just symbols. Third, treat cash as a reserve and a tool, not as your whole strategy. Fourth, understand taxes, fees, and inflation as permanent partners in the room. They are always there. Pretending not to notice them does not make them smaller. Fifth, stop asking how to look rich and start asking how to become financially difficult to shake. That is the whole thing. Because once you understand the game, you see that the divide between rich and poor is not mainly a divide in current income. It is a divide in what people have been taught to see and what they have been taught not to see. One person sees a paycheck and feels temporary relief. Another sees capital waiting for instructions. One person sees a house and feels accomplished. Another asks whether the structure produces or consumes. One person sees a savings balance and feels safe. Another asks whether safety without growth is secretly surrender. One person works for money. The other teaches money to work. That difference is not mystical. It is educational. And the system, because it profits from confusion, does not teach it eagerly. That is why your future is too expensive to hand to people who are being paid whether or not you understand the machine. If you take nothing else from me, take this respect money, enough to understand it. Do not worship it. Do not fear it. Do not pretend it does not matter. Respect it enough to know what it is doing when it enters and leaves your life. Respect it enough to know the difference between a strong financial statement and a flattering one. Respect it enough to stop confusing social approval with economic truth. Once you do that, the whole game changes, not in one weekend, not with some theatrical breakthrough. It changes because you stop helping the system use your ignorance against you. And that is where freedom begins.